Ever wondered why a significant wealth gap exists between whites and blacks? It's a question that may not frequently cross our minds, but it's one that holds a profound significance in understanding the economic disparities that persist in our society today. The wealth gap, in essence, is the difference in net worth between different races, specifically between whites and blacks in America. It's a chasm, not a crack, and it's been widening for centuries. Why is this important? Because wealth isn't just about having money in the bank or owning property, it's about security, opportunity, and the ability to weather financial storms. It's about the capacity to invest in education, start businesses, and pass on opportunities to the next generation. Understanding the wealth gap goes beyond acknowledging its existence. It's about comprehending the deep-rooted historical events and systemic injustices that have contributed to this disparity. The legacy of slavery, the era of segregation, discriminatory policies, these are all part of the web that has woven the current economic tapestry we see today. Let's consider this for a moment. Slavery, a system that forcefully extracted labor from African Americans, denying them the ability to accumulate wealth. Segregation, which limited access to quality education and certain housing zones, effectively barring African Americans from economic opportunities. Discriminatory policies, which systematically disadvantaged black individuals and families, further widening the wealth gap. To ignore these historical factors is to disregard the reality of the wealth gap. It's a gap that isn't based on individual behavior or choices, but on a system that has historically and systematically disadvantaged one race over another. To truly understand the wealth gap, we have to confront these uncomfortable truths and understand how they contribute to the economic disparities we see today. The wealth gap isn't a relic of the past, but a living, breathing entity that continues to affect wealth accumulation in black communities. To understand the present, we must examine the past. So, let's delve into history. The starting point for the wealth gap lies in the era of slavery. This was a time when African Americans were denied the basic right to own property, earn wages, or accumulate wealth. It was a time when their labor was exploited, their humanity disregarded, and their potential stunted. Let's think about it. Wealth is often accumulated over generations. Whether it's a family business, a piece of land, or a sum of money saved and invested over time, wealth grows incrementally. It's passed down from parent to child, each generation building upon the last. But for African Americans, the legacy of slavery disrupted this pattern. For nearly 250 years, African Americans labored without wages. They worked the fields, built homes and cities, and contributed to the wealth of a nation that denied them the fruits of their labor. They were the backbone of an economy that flourished on their sweat and blood, yet they were left empty-handed when emancipation finally came. Imagine for a moment working tirelessly for decades but having nothing to show for it. No land to pass down, no savings to invest, no business to bequeath. This was the reality for African Americans emerging from the chains of slavery. They were freed, yes, but they were starting from scratch, with nothing to call their own. The lack of generational wealth resulting from centuries of unpaid labor set African Americans on a back foot. It created a wealth gap that would only widen as the years went by. While white families were able to build upon the wealth of their ancestors, black families were struggling to make ends meet, grappling with the economic fallout of a system that had exploited them for generations. Slavery may have ended, but its economic effects didn't. They simply evolved. The legacy of slavery cast a long shadow, one that continues to affect wealth accumulation in black communities. It's a stark reminder of the injustices of the past, and a call to action for us to rectify these disparities in the present day. Following slavery, segregation became the new reality, further widening the wealth gap. The end of slavery didn't mean the dawn of equality. Instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter of racial discrimination in America, the era of segregation. This period, marked by the separate but equal doctrine, created a chasm in wealth accumulation between blacks and whites, a chasm that persists to this day. Segregation was not only about separate schools and water fountains, it was a comprehensive system designed to limit African Americans' access to quality education, housing, and job opportunities, all crucial for wealth accumulation. Let's delve deeper into each of these areas. First, education. During segregation, African American students were confined to underfunded schools with limited resources. This lack of quality education hindered their ability to gain high-paying jobs, thus limiting their potential to accumulate wealth. Next, housing. Segregation laws and practices like redlining restricted where African Americans could live. often pushing them into low-value properties in underdeveloped neighborhoods. This denied them the opportunity to build wealth through home equity, a common wealth-building strategy for many white families. Lastly, job opportunities. African Americans were often confined to low-wage jobs and denied access to lucrative industries. This wage disparity further compounded the wealth gap. Each of these factors, education, housing, and employment, created a cycle of poverty that was difficult to break. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 officially abolished segregation, the economic disparities it created were already deeply entrenched. Overcoming the legacy of segregation isn't just about changing laws. It's about addressing the deep-rooted economic disparities it created. It's about acknowledging that the wealth gap isn't just a result of individual choices or abilities, but a systemic issue rooted in centuries of racial discrimination. Segregation may have been abolished, but the economic disparities it created persist. Understanding this is a crucial step in addressing and rectifying the wealth disparities we see today. Discriminatory policies, both subtle and overt, have perpetuated the wealth gap. We're now delving into a darker chapter of our story. The discriminatory policies that had, and continue to have, a profound impact on the wealth accumulation of African Americans. Let's begin with a policy that was as devastating as it was prevalent: redlining. This practice, which began in the early 20th century, involved marking areas with a high population of African Americans as risky for mortgage lending. Despite the fact that many residents in these areas were just as capable of repaying loans as those in predominantly white neighborhoods, they were denied access to affordable mortgages. This severely limited their ability to buy homes and build wealth, creating a ripple effect that still impacts the African American community today. Next, we'll discuss wage discrimination, a subtler but equally harmful policy. For decades, African Americans have been paid significantly less than their white counterparts for doing the same work. This wage gap has made it harder for African Americans to save, invest, and accumulate wealth. Even today, the wage gap persists, further widening the wealth disparity between white and African American households. Lastly, let's talk about predatory lending. This is a practice where lenders target vulnerable borrowers with unfair loan terms. African Americans have often been the victims of such practices, finding themselves trapped in a cycle of debt that makes wealth accumulation almost impossible. Predatory lending, like redlining and wage discrimination, has contributed significantly to the wealth gap we see today. These discriminatory policies have certainly left a lasting scar on the financial health of the African American community. While some of these practices have been outlawed or reformed, their effects are far from erased. African Americans still face the consequences of these policies, struggling with lower wages, limited access to affordable housing, and predatory lending practices. These policies may have changed on paper, but their impact remains. As we move forward, it's crucial to remember this history and work towards policies that not only prevent such discrimination, but also actively promote wealth accumulation for all. Understanding the roots of the wealth gap is the first step towards rectifying it. We've journeyed through the historical factors and systemic injustices that have contributed to the wealth gap between whites and blacks. From the legacy of slavery to segregation and discriminatory policies, all these have had a profound impact on wealth accumulation in black communities. Before we can address the wealth gap, we must first acknowledge that it exists, that it's deep-rooted, and has been perpetuated by systemic injustices. But we must also recognize that the past does not have to dictate the future. We can change our course, but it will require concerted and sustained efforts from everyone. Education is a powerful tool for change. By promoting financial literacy, we can empower individuals to make informed decisions about their finances. This can lead to better saving habits, wise investment choices, and ultimately, wealth accumulation. But education alone is not enough. It must be coupled with equal access to opportunities. Policy changes are also critical. We've seen the detrimental effects of discriminatory policies, and it's time to reverse them. This includes fair housing policies, equal employment opportunities, and equitable access to quality education. By changing the rules of the game, we can level the playing field. Community initiatives also play a pivotal role in addressing the wealth gap. These initiatives can provide resources, mentorship, and support for individuals and businesses in black communities. By pooling resources and working together, communities can create a ripple effect of positive change. In conclusion, addressing the wealth gap is a complex task that requires a multifaceted approach. It involves shifting mindsets, changing policies, and fostering community growth. It's a daunting task, but not an impossible one. The wealth gap didn't form overnight and it won't close overnight, but with awareness, understanding, and concerted effort, progress is possible. Let's not forget that every journey begins with a single step, and together we can take that step towards a more equitable future.